Thank you. So it's a great opportunity for me to meet you. It's mainly a good opportunity to become acquainted with intellectual circles in Belgrade and people, intellectuals. And so I'm working here in Belgrade since last July, and so it's quite at the beginning of my Serbian experience. And so Heinrich Böll Foundation is, let me talk just some more few words about me and bioethics. So when I was in headquarters of Heinrich Böll Foundation, so I was dealing with bioethics. I was dealing with education, science politics, and bioethics. And I worked about stem cell research, worked about patients' decrease, living will, things like that. And Böll Foundation is affiliated to the German Greens, and it might be interesting to you that the German Greens they are not comparable to any of the great ideologies. The conservatives on the one hand, the liberals on the one hand, the socialists. So that's this third ideology, the main ideology. So German Greens take parts of all these three ideologies. So within the Greens there is a strong conservative stream. So they are very cautious about things like euthanasia, or even stem cell research, because protection of the embryos, protection of human beings, defined as starting from the melting of egg and same. And so there is the Green Party. So it's in a way, it's split. So dealing with these issues. So it's an ongoing debate. So within the Greens and of course within German society. And so as long as I worked in this field, so we felt to be part of a civil movement. So as I grow older, it's more and more important to me. So what I'm dealing with, and there are very active civil society movements from elder people who want to have control over the dying process. They are afraid of tackled with a high-tech medicine, which doesn't allow for them to die. So what I'm talking about is more a sociological assessment, than a philosophical, arguing, because I feel to be part of a movement. And the work I did in Germany had some impact. We tried to exert pressure on the German parliament. Eventually they passed a law allowing patient decree. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so this may be enough for the moment. I'm talking about two topics: changing public interest of an aging society, and so I try to give it a second frame. I would like to call it long-term changes towards an inner-worldly self-sanctification. So let's see what that might be. So I start. During the previous years, there was an entire series of new legal regulations concerning dying in Europe and the United States. In Oregon, United States, and in Switzerland, the law provides for legal physician-assisted suicide. Years ago, the Netherlands and Belgium had legalized active euthanasia, the killing on demand. These recent developments are being closely monitored in Germany. However, due to the shame about the crimes of the nationalist socialist policy of euthanasia, the political elite in Germany is not willing to undertake similar new steps. This is remarkable. Opinion polls show that the medically ethical standpoints of the German political elite very much differ from those of the majority of the population. One would ask the question why this is the case when it comes to these very issues. Political parties deploy a multitude of opinion pollsters in order to be kept up to date, to be familiar with the people's needs and wishes as a way of formulating promising partisan strategies. When it comes to the issue of dying, in Germany there is a kind of reason of state the political elite feels committed to. Innovations are not only introduced against the given governing coalition, but most frequently also fought against the entire parliament. A few years ago, following a years-long debate, the German parliament passed a new law on patient decree. It stipulates that the patient can lay down a kind of medical will about the cases in which, if at all, the medical system is allowed to undertake life-saving and life-sustaining measures. For example, the patient can define in advance that he or she is not to be administered a blood transfusion. By doing so, she decreases his chances of survival in an operation, but does so according to her own will and religious conviction. For instance, this is the case for the Jehovah's Witnesses, which we decline to get blood transfusion. He can define that in case of falling into a coma, no artificial feeding or respiration are to take place. In that case, he specifies that he prefers dying and that the medical personnel are to respect this testamentary direction. As a rule, it is even sufficient that a person at some point verbally communicates his convictions and wishes concerning dying, provided that these witnesses can be found, often years and decades thereafter. The patients will remain binding in this case too. Euthanasia, the killing on demand in a situation of pain and hopelessness, does not exist in Germany. Medical assistance with voluntary suicide is also not explicitly permitted in Germany. It is possible under certain circumstances. However, the physician who provides such assistance risks judicial proceeding and the loss of his or her practicing license, because the political elite, churches, and the medical officials are vehemently fighting against it. What is the view of the people on this issue? Unlike active euthanasia, killing on request, which the majority of the population would not forbid, but also does not support, many people in Germany declare themselves in favor of the possibility of medical participation in the voluntarily chosen suicide. Also, a third of the German medical professionals can imagine their participation under certain circumstances. What is so interesting regarding the debate on the medically guided and supported suicide is the fact that it leads the way out of the ideological controversy between self-determination on the one hand and the religious interpretations of creation and life as a gift on the other, and opens up the view to the actual goal of the debates on the freedom to die, the improvement, on the one hand, of the medical, as a rule, palliative care of dying patients in a trustworthy dialogue-based relationship towards nurse, doctor, and family member. It is my conviction that the freedom to die can and should be realized as kind of self-determination in a dialogue. That is the term I've published with two prior books. So, When people in Germany are asked how they would wish to die, 80% answer suddenly and unexpectedly. Only 20% wish to be prepared for death and die consciously. Those answers reflect the departure from the religious framework of dying and death. For a religious person, it is not death that is the problem, but the uncertainty of the moment of its occurrence. Dying is the problem rather than death. That is said in the medieval wisdom, mors certa, ora incerta. Death is certain, it's not. Therefore, it is uncertain when the preparation for death should begin. When should one complete this life and accept death as a transit station in belief of life after death? Dying itself, in most cases the relatively short process of dying, has therefore a high religious meaning for the conscious transition beyond. Today it is the opposite. The phase of dying is often tied to a long period of infirmity, care, dependency, and pain. That is what the people fear. It is the reason why they wish for a sudden death. That is exactly what the religious person fears the most or has feared in more religious times. Still, this wish for a sudden death is a pious wish as guaranteed to people loved by gods such as Philemon and Baucis in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Dying today is indeed long, and many situations of medically assisted dying call for a decision on whether additional therapy or life-preserving should take place. Of course, death remains a certainty. However, its hour is to a wide extent placed in our hands. For example, in thousands of cases, a decision is made that an additional gastric tube is to be administered, thus delaying death. Decisions are being made here, even though those who make them believe that it is not a matter of choice or deciding because the patient must be kept alive. The arguments in favor of medically assisted suicide shed new light on this situation. Namely, the medically assisted suicide is a matter of the patient's wish for conscious death. He or she mostly prepares for weeks rather than sudden death. This turn in the conscious control over one's ill body reflects a new kind of inner worldly and religious practice. It is a practice of self-sanctification, I try to call it that way, self-sanctification through disposal of one's own body. Foucault named this the care of the self in the tradition of the ancient cura sui. The wish for a person to dispose of their own body as part of their care of the self is in line with additional legal developments of the progressive self-determination concerning one's own body. The abolition of laws against sexual self-determination on the one hand, and the introduction of new offenses pertaining to violation of the sexual self-determination, that is, sexual assault or marital rape, on the other. So these are the most sociological and historical framings I start from. So in brackets, as you are mostly interested in philosophy, I will talk a bit about slippery slope, although I do not make use of these arguments, but you are probably interested into that. What is the Church's standpoint on euthanasia and medically assisted suicide, and what arguments are offered by the slippery slope argument, which is by far the most common consideration pointed out against legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide? Today, churches use the slippery slope argument by threatening with numerous dangers and dissuasive images in their efforts against the suicide assisted by medical professionals and family members. Some once which have previously been used against the binding nature of the patient decree. There is talk of disposal of the weak in an euthanasia industry. Horrifying images of large-scale accidents or calamities are being depicted. These claims do not have any empirical proof. That's why the slippery slope argument cannot convince. Wherever there is legal medical participation in suicide, neither the elderly nor the disabled or persons who are socially or in other ways disadvantaged are being pushed away from life. Such claims are ethically also not sustainable. Namely, an individual's wish for death cannot be responded to with general concerns and claims of the threatening economy of death. The images and standards in which first the patient decree and now the assisted and medically assisted suicide and active euthanasia are being fought against, even demonized, prove how much religious conviction of deadly sin are placed in this context. However, they remain at best religious convictions which in a pluralist society can lay claims for respect but no supra-individual validity, and which incidentally are also not convincing as inner-worldly promises of socially embedded and palliatively assisted good death in a theological and Christian sense, since it is over-evaluation of palliative medicine, painless dying since in its over-evaluation of palliative medicine, painless dying steps in the place of the blessed dying, which was used in the former times. All kinds of measures are taken just to secure inner-worldly discipline and maintain state control over life and death by those who are entitled to it, through the medical profession and medical institutions with a considerable economic purpose. That way, the churches have nothing to offer but a modern care of the self. The only difference lies in the fact that the modern self-sanctification is inner-worldly and individual, whereas the churches advocate a collectivist variant of self-sanctification, which does not go hand in hand with modern claims of autonomy. So now let's come with a few words on slippery slope. So in this field, there are two kinds of slippery slope arguments used: the conceptual slippery slope and the empirical argument. The conceptual, the argument supposes that by allowing A, whose justifying principle necessarily also justifies B, the force of logic will require one to allow B as well. Applied to euthanasia, the notion is that if one accepts autonomy as the justifying principle, then one will be forced to allow not only euthanasia for the terminally ill, A, but also, for example, euthanasia for those who simply want to die, B. The argument reflects the one law, one principle fallacy, the notion that for any law there must be one and only one justifying principle. The argument is intrinsically incoherent because in most cases there are more than one justifying principle. The empirical argument, and the legal control variant, it says that forbidding A is supposed to be the only effective way of making sure that B does not happen. A sound use of this argument could go like this: if we allow politicians large contributions except if they are being paid for their vote on some issue, we will never be able to enforce the exception. The only workable line is a complete prohibition of such contribution. That's always an interesting argument against funding political parties by private donations, but that's leading away. In case of euthanasia, the argument goes like this: legal control of euthanasia will not be able to prevent the non-voluntary medical killing of the vulnerable, that is, the old and infirm, the poor and deprived, the sick and handicapped, women and members of other vulnerable minorities. But the opposite is probably true, empirically true. As far as euthanasia proper in the Netherlands, where we have some experience, is concerned, it is clear that doctors do not like to perform it, and that patients who cannot stand up for their wishes in dealing with their doctors have little chance of persuading them to do so. It is exactly the group of the vulnerable who would be least successful in persuading their doctors, because on their educational abilities, their ability to argue for their will. Now, let's turn a bit closer to the doctor-patient relationship. One more general argument suggests that the confident doctor-patient relationship would be disturbed by the possibility of assisted suicide or its legalization. However, this relationship is today disturbed and must be at least re-established. So I have to put in brackets a short remark. So in the German language, we have a differentiation between occupation and profession, so which is different from the use in the English-speaking world. In the English-speaking world, you use occupation for people who have undergone a vocational training, and professionals are all those who have passed an academic exam. In Germany, we use the expression occupation for both, those with vocational training as well as with an educational and academic education. We use profession for those who are in a particular relation to state interests. The traditional professions are the physicians, theologians, and jurists. So they do not pass a university exam. In Germany, they pass a so-called state exam, so it's controlled from the state, because they are working in the interest of the state. The interest of the state, using jurists, is having control over how people are acting. So, in a general sense. Using the theologians is having control about the souls of the people, and using the physicians having control about the bodies. So, I'm going to talk a bit more about profession and the fight against professions in Germany. You have to understand that it has a different meaning from profession in the English-speaking Anglo-Saxon world. So, we are talking about that there is a relationship between patients and physicians that is not based on trust. Trust has to be re-established. Today, laymen, and we have a vivid civil society of laymen who, based on internet, based on reading books, so have their own opinion about what is good for them. So, and do not rely that much on the professions. That's the background. However, this relationship is today disturbed and must be re-established. Today, laymen do not rely anymore on the privileged knowledge of the professionals. They do not allow for their construction of the world to be devalued, uncontested, and it deviates increasingly as they get older from the traditional professional perspective on the proper actions in the face of death. The less the medical profession is prepared to address this discrepancy between the layman's knowledge of the world and professional knowledge, the less will the profession receive the trust it requires. So today it is a matter of once again strengthening a relationship of confidence through confidence-building framework conditions which take seriously the patient's claim to self-determination and protection from the violation of their individuality and dignity. but it's also a matter of equaling to somewhat blatant social inequality which exists today among those who assert their will as individuals in hospitals and nursing homes, as I told above. So the educated are able to convince the doctors to behave like they want them to. So, also, the blatant social inequality which exists today among those who assert their will as individuals in hospitals and nursing homes too, and many of those whose individuality is subject to recollectivization, the production of a conformist self-determination. So they want what they are wanted to want. So yeah. The dignity of the patient is often being positioned against any form of socially accepted suicide assistance or killing on request. It is the weakest that ought to be protected from any kind of tendency of an economically reasoned, socially acceptable shortening of the life's end. In doing so, the impression is created that dignity and protection of life take place in an economy-free death zone. However, in reality, those who are participating professionally are fully aware of the fact that their commitment to the unlimited treatment at the end of life without consideration of the related costs is a particularly active tool in the struggle for distribution of social resources. One should also not rule out that hospitals, at least in Germany, and nursing homes could have an economic interest in a long-delayed death because it is with thus generated income that they can cross-subsidize other areas that are much stronger controlled and directed towards efficiency. The priority of constitutionally guaranteed patient rights and the legal right to binding living wills means the will of the patient has also priority when he turns against therapies considered by the doctor to be advisable. It is only the enforcement of this principle that creates trust. Today, by contrast, patients must worry whether they will be indeed recognized, and their suspicion is great and often rightful too, on whether life-prolonging measures are taken which are not medically indicated. For example, it can be doubtful whether the 140,000 gastric tubes which are annually installed in Germany are indeed medically indicated, that is, follow a justifiable therapy objective, or whether they follow no therapy objective or are even harmful and thus contraindicated. What is the patient decree all about? The patient decree demands alternatives from the practicing physician or caretaker. The palliative medicine is thereby an ally on the mistrustful patients in the struggle against bad medicine, which presents itself as having no alternative in the consciousness of a privileged, uncommitted guarantor. The patient decree, which rejects life-sustaining measures, does not urge the caretaker to give up on ill persons, but the opposite, to devote themselves instead of securing relationships in an accustomed manner through tube feeding, to develop relationship adequate to the situation and ultimately bring them to an end. It is no death decree, but a treatment decree, an instrument of life affirmation in a way, strengthening of individuality, which is only possible in social relationships, and defending of a life without judging any particular individuality. It is beyond doubt and often emphasized in politics that palliative medicine in Germany, probably all over Europe, has to be developed further when it comes to the rising life expectancy of the people. This does not take place, however, it is too slow. However, palliative medicine can only cover the minimal requirement. It would be arguable to instrumentalize it against an individual wish of a doctor's assistance in suicide. The legalization of suicide assistance, as in the US state Oregon, can much more improve the palliative care by opening a discussion on the available alternative treatments. Between 1/3 and half of the people who have until now expressed the wish to be prescribed a deadly medicament in Oregon did not use it. It is possible that the prospect of a freely selectable alternative decreases the concern on loss of control and heteronomy. However, one would ask too much of palliative medicine if one would demand from it to ban all death wishes. This gesture does surface here and there as if the capitulation before pain and losing hope were principally curable. However, this entitlement claim is inappropriate and contradicts the role of palliative medicine as an ally of increasingly distrustful patients. In certain cases of the hardest suffering, the only thing that remains for ill people is to capitulate. It is precisely these people to whom palliative medicine should be accessible and help them in maintaining their dignity and self-determination. The state, the dying, would like to be remembered by their families. My plea for the palliatively embedded approval of medical participation and the voluntarily chosen suicide is governed by the conviction that the confidential relationship between patient and doctor and caretaker improves, and this also contributes to the self-determination of the patient in dialogue. Whether this is the case represents an empirical question which can be attempted to answer by surveying individual countries which allow medically assisted suicide, Switzerland and the US federal state of Oregon. Just some short remarks on that. Switzerland leaves the decision on the medical participation up to the medical conscience without its own law and specific diligence requirements. Obviously, a great social confidence in the medical profession, which is necessary for such an approach, still exists in Switzerland, which it does not in Germany. The Swiss guidelines regarding the nursing of patients at the end of life clearly proscribe that the participation in suicide calls for deciding in accordance with one's conscience, and that the society looks upon doctors' decisions in such cases with confidence and respect. Quote, on the one hand, the assistance in suicide is not part of the medical profession, since it contradicts the objective of medicine. On the other hand, respect of the patient's will is the basis of the doctor-patient relationship. This dilemma requires a personal decision based on the doctor's conscience. The decision to provide assistance in suicide in individual cases should be respected as such. This is from a guideline for physicians in Switzerland. These formulations are the model for the early 2011 principles of the German Medical Association in medical assisted death, with the formulation that the doctor's participation in suicide was no medical task. They could have opened the path for the doctor's decision based on their conscience, whether he or she views assisted suicide to a task of medical attention or not. This path has been initially blocked by the new edition of the Medical Professional Code of Conduct in Germany, which was adopted in late 2011. The Code of Conduct forbids medical participation in voluntarily chosen suicide. Obviously, the representatives of the medical profession, in the German meaning of the word, so we have significantly less trust in their colleagues than is the case in Switzerland. On the other hand, legal regulation of the medical participation in suicide took place in US state of Oregon with the Oregon Death with Dignity Act of 1997. In this case, too, the doctors have to guarantee their participation with their conscience. However, this law adopted in the referendum with a thin majority does not rely on it, but rather stipulates comprehensive cautions and obligations, inter alia the inclusion of a second independent and thus controlling doctor. As the evaluation of the practice in Oregon shows, there was neither a significant rise in suicide nor were there known cases of misuse. The advantage of the strict legal regulation in Oregon as opposed to Swiss rather liberal and pragmatic practice can be even seen in the fact that the medical assisted suicide is, as a rule, integrated in the palliative medical care structures and thus part of a rather comprehensive securing of self-determination of suffering patients in a dialogue, as opposed to finding a conclusion in backrooms or horrific parking lot scenes as often seen in Switzerland. Therefore, it is only commendable that the most important and best studies on the subject of dying, letting dying and medically assisted suicide relate cautiously, positively to the Oregon model, whereas they vehemently dismiss killing on request as permitted in the Netherlands and Belgium. That's it for the moment. Thank you.